For most of the last 100 years, the deal went like this. You rent when you're young and broke, and you buy when you can so that by the time you're old, the house is paid off and the house is the plan. That deal is quietly breaking. The fastest growing group of renters in America right now isn't 20-somethings, it's people over 65. And renting after 65 splits into two completely different stories. One group is choosing it, the other can't escape it. This episode is about the money underneath both. Start with the old model. For decades, the American retirement plan wasn't really a plan, it was a house. You paid off a mortgage over 30 years, and the paid-off home became the biggest asset most families ever held. It was shelter nobody could evict you from, and a nest egg you could borrow against or sell at the very end. So why are so many older Americans renting instead? A few reasons, and they stack on top of each other. Some never bought at all, priced out during their working years or wiped out by a divorce or a medical bill. Some owned, then sold, and now can't buy back in at today's prices. And some are renting on purpose, downsizing out of a big house they no longer want to clean, repair, or pay property tax on. Renting in old age is also far more common for Black and Hispanic seniors, a direct echo of who was able to buy a home earlier in life and who got shut out of that chance. Here's the scale of it. Between 2013 and 2023, the number of renters aged 65 and older grew by about 2.5 million. That was the largest jump of any age group in the country by a wide margin. Over roughly the same stretch, the population 65 and over climbed from around 43 million to 58 million. But the number that matters most is about wealth. A renter has no home equity, no ownership stake building up underneath them, and older renters hold only about 2% of the net wealth that older homeowners do. Same age, completely different financial ground to stand on. Now the money. Rent is the whole story here because unlike a mortgage, it never ends and it never turns into ownership. Nationally, the median asking rent on a newly listed apartment recently crossed $1,900 a month. That's the middle of the market, and it swings enormously by region. A one-bedroom in a small Midwestern town and a one-bedroom on the California coast are not the same planet. Now, put that rent next to the income most older renters actually live on. The average Social Security retirement check, that's the monthly benefit the federal government pays to retired workers, runs a little over $2,000 a month in 2026. Call it about $25,000 a year. So for a typical older renter, rent alone can swallow the entire Social Security check, with little left for food, medicine, or heat. Economists have a name for this. When housing eats more than 30% of your income, you're what they call cost-burdened. Among older renters, 58% are cost-burdened, and more than half of that group spends over half of everything they bring in just to keep a roof over their heads. That's not a small, unlucky corner of the population. That's the majority of older renters in the country. And here's a detail that's easy to miss. Most older renters are women. For women, 65 and older who rent, the typical income sits around $27,000 a year because they tend to live longer, live alone more often, and earned less across a lifetime of lower wages. So the person most exposed to rising rent in old age is, more often than not, a woman living by herself. Then there's the top of the market, which tells the exact opposite story. A whole industry of age-restricted apartments marketed as active adult living has sprung up for older renters who do have money. Buildings with fitness rooms, social calendars, and no yard work. In some cities, those rents top $3,000 a month. In Miami, the average runs close to $3,500, so renting after 65 can mean a luxury apartment chosen for convenience, or it can mean a monthly bill that quietly empties a fixed income. Same word. Two completely different economies. Here's where it gets interesting because Wall Street has noticed older renters, and from an investor's point of view, they're close to an ideal customer. Think about the pitch. A lot of these residents aren't working, which sounds like a weakness and is actually the opposite. Their income, Social Security, and a pension arrives every single month no matter what the wider economy is doing. During the 2020 shutdowns, when younger tenants lost jobs and missed rent, Age-restricted senior buildings were still collecting close to 100%. Recession-proof rent. They also stay put. Turnover in these communities runs around 25% a year versus roughly 50% in regular apartments. And every time a tenant leaves, the landlord eats cleaning costs, marketing, and empty weeks with no rent coming in. Older renters move less, so they cost less to keep. On top of that, operators charge a premium for the whole package, often 15 to 20% more than a comparable ordinary apartment. Demand is even being fed from an unexpected direction, so-called gray divorce. Older couples splitting up late in life and suddenly needing two homes where there used to be one. So who owns these buildings? Increasingly, big institutional money. Real estate investment trusts, companies called REITs, that pool investor money to buy property and pass the rental income back out to shareholders. Alongside them, private equity firms, which buy assets using borrowed money and aim to sell them later for more. One senior housing REIT alone carries a market value north of $30 billion. The rent your neighbor pays becomes a dividend for someone who has never seen the building, and the money flows toward the profitable end of the market. The demand is enormous. The National Investment Center for Seniors Housing and Care estimates the country needs something like 100,000 new senior housing units a year to keep up with the aging population, and builders are delivering only a small fraction of that. But the units that do get built are mostly the high-margin ones, the $3,000 apartments, because that's where the returns are. Affordable senior housing rarely pencils out for private capital. Nobody gets rich renting to a retiree living on $25,000 a year. So the market simply builds less of it. This is the part most people get wrong, so let's be precise about who actually covers the rent. The short answer is mostly the renter out of pocket from that fixed income. Start with what does not help. Medicare, the federal health insurance program for people 65 and older, pays for doctors and hospitals. It does not pay your rent, not $1 of it. Medicaid, the joint federal and state program for people with low income, covers healthcare and, importantly, long-term nursing care. It also does not pay ordinary rent. So the two big government programs everyone ties to old age both stop at the front door. Private coverage doesn't rescue you either. Medigap, the supplemental insurance people buy to fill Medicare's gaps, covers medical bills, not housing. And even long-term care insurance, the product marketed precisely for old age, pays for care, not for a place to live. None of it touches the rent. Housing help comes from a completely different place, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There are two main lifelines. Housing choice vouchers, what most people still call Section 8, cover part of the rent for low-income tenants, and Section 202, a program built specifically for low-income seniors, caps their rent at 30% of their income and has the government pay the rest. Sounds like a solution. Here's the catch. These programs are rationed. Wait lists routinely run for years. The government stopped funding new Section 202 construction back in 2012, even as the older population exploded. The average household in one of these senior units lives on around $16,000 a year. These are exactly the people the program was designed for, and there still aren't close to enough units to go around. So what happens to everyone in between? Too comfortable for the wait list to move quickly, too stretched to absorb a big rent hike. Most of the time, family fills the gap, quietly, out of their own accounts. And for the people without family money behind them, the outcome is the one nobody likes to say out loud: housing instability and a slowly rising number of Americans reaching their 70s and 80s without a stable place to live. The sticker rent is only the visible part. The real cost of renting late in life is what compounds underneath it. Start with the escalator. Every year, Social Security gets a cost of living adjustment, a COLA, a small bump meant to keep pace with inflation. In a typical recent year, that raise has landed in the low single digits. But your rent increase doesn't check what your COLA was first. When rent climbs faster than your raise, which it often does, you lose a little ground every single year silently on an income that can't grow to catch up. 10 years of that math gets brutal. And in the senior housing sector specifically, rents have lately been climbing around 5% a year, well ahead of most cost of living bumps. Point that gap in one direction for a decade, and it quietly rewrites a person's entire budget. Then there's what a renter never builds. A homeowner spends 30 years turning payments into equity, and at the end there's an asset, something to borrow against, sell for care, or leave behind. A renter makes payments for 30 years and ends with a stack of receipts. There's no house to pass down. The wealth simply never accumulates. There's also the lock-in. Older renters move less than almost anyone, and not only because they'd rather stay. Moving is expensive and physically hard, so many absorb a bad rent increase rather than face the cost and upheaval of relocating. And the landlord knows it. Staying put becomes its own kind of trap. There are smaller drains layered on top. Application fees, security deposits, the price of movers on the day you finally do have to go. None of it is huge on its own. All of it tends to land on the person least able to plan around it. Underneath all of it sits the cost that's hardest to put a number on and very real anyway. The loss of security. A paid-off house is a floor you can't fall through. Rent is a bill that keeps arriving in your 80s and your 90s in a market you don't control at the one stage of life when your income has stopped growing for good. So why is it built this way? Not because anyone's twirling a mustache in a boardroom, because the incentives point straight here. Private capital builds what pays. Luxury active adult apartments earn strong, steady returns. So that's what gets built. Affordable senior housing earns thin returns, so it mostly doesn't, which is why the government has to step in, and why, when the government builds less, the gap just widens. Step back a little further, and you can see the choice the country made decades ago. America decided its main retirement savings machine would be the owned home, propped up by mortgage tax breaks and a century of policy, while help for renters would stay a smaller program you have to qualify for and wait in line for. Own. And the whole system is built around you, rent, and you're mostly on your own. Now run the demographics forward. The baby boomers are aging into their 80s in enormous numbers, straight through the 2030s. More of them are reaching old age without ever having owned a home. People are living longer, which just means more years of rent to pay. Every one of those trends pushes the number of older renters up and pushes the gap between what the market builds and what people can afford even wider. To be fair, renting isn't all downside. No maintenance, no property tax, no roof to replace, and the freedom to pack up and leave. For some people, that's honestly the better deal. But it removes the one cushion old age in America used to come with. So what does renting after 65 actually deliver? It depends entirely on which side of the line you land on. If you have money, it buys freedom. A low-maintenance life you chose, with someone else fixing the furnace. If you don't, it buys exposure. A permanent bill on an income that grows slower than the rent, with no equity underneath you, and a wait list standing in for a safety net. And the split isn't random. It tracks who managed to own a home earlier in life and who never got the chance, which means the rental math of old age often just extends the wealth gaps people already carried for decades, and the economics reward the same party either way. Whoever owns the building, the tenant carries the risk. The landlord collects a check that climbs faster than the tenant's income ever will. For most of American history, the house was the thing that made growing old affordable. Take the house out of the equation, and old age turns into something simpler and harder. A monthly bill you never stop paying, in a market that was never designed with you in mind. If this breakdown helped the numbers make a little more sense, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It's the simplest way to tell us these are worth making.